My son-in-law laughed when he found out I sold vacuum cleaners for a living. He said it right at the dinner table, in front of my daughter, in front of his parents, like it was a joke everyone was supposed to enjoy. Nobody corrected him, not even my own daughter. I just kept eating, because 40 years of practice had taught me that silence sometimes carries more weight than any argument ever could. What none of them knew was that I hadn't sold a single vacuum cleaner in over a decade. I had sold the company. Then I sold 3 more. I kept driving the same beat-up Corolla, kept wearing the same flannel shirts, kept showing up to family dinners as the awkward old man from the wife's side, because somewhere along the way, I decided that being underestimated was safer than being resented. My late wife used to tell me I'd regret that choice one day. She was right, as usual. The regret arrived on a rainy Tuesday in October, in the form of an email from my daughter Claire. Subject line: some ground rules for Thanksgiving. 14 numbered items. No mention of turkey, no mention of what time to arrive. Just rules. Don't bring up your business ideas, item 4. Sit at the far end of the table, item 7. Don't embarrass Michael in front of his partners, item 11. Because apparently his law firm's senior partners were coming this year, and my presence was, in her words, a variable she couldn't control. I read it twice, standing in my kitchen with the porch light flickering behind me. I didn't call her. I didn't argue. I opened my laptop instead, and I looked at something I hadn't looked at in 3 years, the cap table of Michael's own law firm, the one his father-in-law, meaning me, had quietly bailed out of bankruptcy back when Michael was still in law school, back before anyone in that family knew my name was worth anything at all. I closed the laptop, poured a glass of water, and made a decision the way I always made decisions. Quietly, completely, without asking permission from anyone who had never bothered to ask about me. Thanksgiving was 19 days away, and for the first time in 10 years I was going to show up exactly on time. The 19 days passed the way important things always do in my life, quietly, methodically, one small piece at a time. I called my lawyer, Frank Delaney, on a Wednesday morning. Frank had handled my affairs since before Claire was born, and he had the particular calm of a man who had seen every kind of family mess money could create. "You've been sitting on this for years," he said, once I explained what I wanted. "You sure you want to move now?" "I'm sure," I said. "I just need it done quietly. No press, no calls to Michael. Nothing until I say so." Frank didn't ask why. He never did. He just said, "Give me a week." It took him 5 days. Turned out I already held 18% of Whitfield and Cross, the firm Michael worked for, through a holding company from an old investment nobody in the family had ever asked me about. Because nobody in the family had ever asked me about anything. 18% wasn't control, but it was enough to matter, and enough to grow, if I moved carefully. So I moved carefully. I liquidated part of my second company, the one Claire didn't know existed, and I began buying quietly through Frank's firm, block by block, the way a man builds a wall, one brick at a time, instead of dropping it all at once and drawing attention to the shape of what he's building. Every evening I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, and I watched the number climb. 18, 19.2, 21. Claire called twice that week. Once about seating arrangements, once to remind me, gently but firmly, not to mention my old vacuum days around Michael's partners, since apparently the joke had become a kind of shorthand in that family, a way of placing me exactly where they wanted me to stay. I said, "Of course, sweetheart. I understand." And I did understand. I understood completely for the first time in a long time. On the 12th day, Frank called with news that made me set my coffee down. 24.6, he said. "Daniel, you're closing in on a blocking position on the partnership vote." I looked out my kitchen window at the bare maple tree in the yard, the one my wife had planted the spring after Claire was born. "Keep going," I said, quietly. "All the way to Thanksgiving if you have to." 7 days left. And somewhere in that house full of rules with my name attached to none of them, nobody had any idea what was coming to dinner. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and clear. The kind of sharp, autumn light that makes even ordinary streets look like something worth remembering. I put on the same gray sweater I always wore to these dinners, the one Claire once called the sad dad sweater, when she thought I wasn't listening. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. Then I opened my closet and took out the navy suit I hadn't worn since my last company's closing dinner. I put it on instead. Frank had called me twice already that morning. The second call, at 9:40, was the one that mattered. 26.3, he said. Daniel, you're not just blocking anymore. If Michael's firm tries to push through the merger with Voss and Kane next quarter, they can't do it without you. You could delay it. You could kill it outright. Good, I said. Don't do anything with it yet. Just be ready when I call. You're really doing this at the dinner table? I'm doing this the way I do everything. Frank, quietly, and only when it's time. I drove to Claire's house at exactly noon. The time printed on the invitation, though I knew from years of experience that on time in that household actually meant 15 minutes early for cocktails and small talk with people who had never once asked what I used to do for a living, only what I currently didn't. Claire opened the door and her smile faltered for half a second when she saw the suit. Dad, you look different. I decided to make an effort, I said, and stepped past her into the house before she could find the right words to respond. The dining room was already half full. Michael stood near the fireplace in a group of 3 men in expensive suits, laughing at something, glass of scotch in hand. When he saw me, his eyes flicked once. Quickly to the suit, then back to his colleagues. The way a man recalculates a room he thought he already understood. Daniel, he said, extending a hand with the same efficient, distracted grip he'd offered me at every dinner for the past 6 years. Didn't expect the upgrade. Big day? You could say that, I said and took my seat. Not at the far end of the table, item 7. At the head of it, where the water glass still had ice in it, and nobody had thought to argue, because nobody yet understood there was anything left to argue about. Dinner was 20 minutes from starting, and I still had 1 phone call left to make. Nobody said anything about the seat at first. Claire's mother-in-law, a sharp-eyed woman named Pamela, who collected other people's discomfort the way some people collect stamps, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Michael laughed it off, telling his partner some story about Dad's little rebellion phase, and everyone chuckled the polite, empty chuckle of people who had already decided who. I was years ago and saw no reason to update the file. I let them have their laugh. I had learned a long time ago that a man who laughs along with his own dismissal is a man nobody bothers to watch closely. The turkey came out at noon. Claire moved around the table, refilling wine glasses, her eyes finding me every so often with a kind of nervous, searching look. The look of a daughter who senses something is different, but can't name what. It was somewhere between the stuffing and the cranberry sauce that one of Michael's senior partners, a heavy-set man named Gerald Voss, leaned toward me with the polite condescension of someone making conversation with the help. So, Daniel, Claire tells us you were in sales. Appliances, was it? Vacuum cleaners, Michael said before I could answer, grinning at his own joke like it hadn't gone stale 6 years ago. Door to door, if I remember the story right. Something like that, I said and took a slow sip of water. Gerald smiled the way people smile, when they think they've correctly measured a man and found him small. Well, good for you. Honest work. It was, I said. Very honest. I built 3 companies out of it, actually. Sold the last one for enough to buy a piece of a law firm I liked the sound of. The table went quiet in that particular way a room goes quiet. When a joke suddenly stops being funny and nobody's sure why yet. Michael's smile stayed frozen on his face a half-second too long. What law firm? I set my water glass down and looked at him directly, the way I used to look at engineers who'd built something structurally unsound and didn't yet know it. Yours, I said. Whitfield and Cross. I hold 26.3% of it, Michael. Have for about a week now. Gerald's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Somewhere down the table, Claire's wine glass made a small, sharp sound against the wood as she set it down too fast. Nobody at that table moved for what felt like a very long time. Gerald Voss set his fork down slowly, the way a man sets something down when he suddenly needs both hands free. That can't be right. The partnership records would show. They do show it, I said. Filed properly through council 3 days ago. Your compliance office should have the notice by Monday if they don't already. Michael's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. You're lying. You sell vacuum cleaners, Daniel. You drive a Corolla with a dent in the door. I do drive a Corolla, I agreed. Man doesn't need a new car just because his balance sheet changed. That was never the part of me you were interested in, so you never bothered asking about the rest. Pamela's sharp eyes had gone very still, calculating something behind them. Claire hadn't said a word. She was staring at me the way you stare at a stranger who has just been introduced, wearing your father's face. Why? Michael said, his voice cracking slightly on the word. Would you do this? Why now, at Thanksgiving? In front of... He gestured at his partners, at the room, at everything he had spent the morning arranging like furniture. Because I got an email 2 weeks ago, I said, and I kept my voice level, the way I'd kept it level. Through 30 years of engineering, reviews and boardroom arguments, 14 numbered rules for how I'm allowed to exist at my own daughter's table. Don't embarrass Michael. Sit at the far end. Don't mention my old business ideas. I looked at Claire. You wrote that I was a variable you couldn't control. Claire's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I am not a variable, I said quietly. I am your father. And I have spent 10 years letting this family believe I was smaller than I am, because it was easier than making anyone uncomfortable. I'm done making that trade. Gerald Voss was already reaching for his phone under the table, thumbs moving fast. The particular panic of a man realizing the ground beneath his firm had shifted, without his permission. Michael hadn't moved at all. He just stared at me like a man watching a building. He lived in quietly lose its foundation, one sentence at a time. The rest of that dinner didn't happen the way Claire had planned it. And it didn't happen the way I'd imagined it either. Sitting alone at my kitchen table 2 weeks earlier, Gerald Voss left before dessert. Already on the phone with his own counsel, already treating me like a man whose name he needed to know properly for the first time. Michael sat frozen for a long while, then finally asked, in a voice stripped of all its courtroom polish, "What do you want, Daniel? What happens now?" Now, I said, the firm goes through a proper compliance review. Because apparently, nobody thought to run one before promising a merger to men like Gerald. And you and I are going to have a very different kind of conversation about what respect actually costs. I didn't destroy the firm. I want to be clear about that, because plenty of people would have, and for a few days I considered it. But I hadn't spent 30 years building things just to enjoy watching one fall apart out of spite. I restructured my position instead, took a quiet advisory seat and let the partners understand, in the calmest terms possible, that the old man in the dented Corolla wasn't going anywhere. Claire found me on the porch that evening, long after the guests had gone, wrapped in her coat against the cold. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked. "Because you never asked," I said. "Not once in 10 years? Did you ask your father what he used to build or what he still could? You only ever asked me to take up less space." She cried then, the real kind. Not the performance kind, and I let her. Because some things a father can't fix with words, only with time, and with finally being seen. We're rebuilding something now, slowly, the two of us. Not the company. Not the money. Just the part where she finally knows my name means something, and I no longer have to shrink myself to fit inside someone else's rules to be allowed at the table. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. More stories like this one are on the way.